Spread the music out. Spread the music out. Good evening, everybody. Good evening, everybody. Hope you had a nice little Okie dokie. Good evening, everybody. Good evening, good evening, good evening. How's everybody doing this evening? Evening wherever you are. Where I am, it's nighttime. It's nearly 11 o'clock p.m. I apologize to you people. I was supposed to do this a few days ago. I'm always supposed to do it a few days ago, but then things come up and then I end up having to delay. But anyway, today's topic, what I'd like to talk about very, very briefly, I'm going to keep it as quick as I can and give people a chance to come in as we start. But the myth about the Europeans ending slavery, okay? To me, that's one of those things that really, really frustrates me because there's this whole narrative that Africans started slavery, Europeans ended slavery. And what I want to try and do with today's live is to talk about, just highlight a few points and then really talk about how we can find solutions to this thing. Because I think ultimately it's pointless getting involved with this thing. It's pointless having these conversations if we're not talking about solutions. We keep looking at the past and just leave it in the past, and people will start saying this is dubious, this part's real, this part's not real, blah blah. But everybody comes up with their own truth. So, long story short, we're gonna try and find solutions today. But let me just go into detail. Some of it will be a rehash of the stuff that we talked about last week. So, first things first. Oh, let me just say this. I think it's very important to mention. Shout out to Modeling and One Journey, Make It Count. Good to see you. Let me just say this. I think we've become super sensitive. Not everybody, but some people have become super sensitive regarding facts or regarding information. And I think this live is not here to tell you a whole history, cradle to grave, with all the nuances. We're just touching on the generalities, some things which people could go back and look at further in their own time. But ultimately, this is not about trying to give a cradle to grave story. We're just focusing on the main parts. So what I like to do, the Europeans started slavery, right? So they started the slave trade. We talked about this last week, okay? Now, they started the slave trade. If you remember, we talked about last week, we talked about how in the year 1441, so 51 years before Columbus had his first voyage, you have a guy by the name of Gonçalves, a Portuguese guy. He's going over to the coast of, near the coast of Morocco, where Morocco would be today, so that northeastern corner of Africa. And they're going to try and get oils, which is something that they used to do at the time. And if you look at the image that I've put up, there's that movie. I forget the name of that movie. Is it In the Heart of the Sea? That's it, with Chris Hemsworth, which is a movie that focuses on how Brits from that part of the world would come to. Can you guys see me? No, you can't. Hold on. Okay. So this film, it was about how Brits would go to that part of the Atlantic and go and try and get these oils from fishes. So they'll capture whales, they'll capture all sorts of sea creatures. This guy's ship actually accidentally, on its way back, ends up going further south than anybody's ever been. And so they find that they're drifted on the coast. Now they're starving, hungry. They say, okay, you know what? Let's go and show King Henry that we can. Let's go show King Henry the Navigator, who's the man who's known for really bringing Europe back into the naval world. They had lost it for many years. Anyway, long story short, he says to himself that let me go and try and bring the naval academy. Let me go and try and bring back some Africans to show the king. Let me find some Africans, let me find some people here and bring them over as souvenirs. So even his mentality is a bit warped. So they go along the west coast of Africa. They go inland, hungry, starving. They get to a settlement where they see like 30 or 40 people. Now there are only about 8 or 9 of them, so it's not as if they can overpower them. So they're like, you know what? Let's bounce before we get killed. On their way back, they see an old black man on his camel, and this is what the documented evidence says. He's there on his camel, and they go and overpower him, injure him, and take him as a slave. They also find another woman a little bit later, an African woman, what they call a Mores, black woman. Mores from the word more, scorched, and then S, female. So it's black woman. They take her, and then on the way back is a man called Nuno Tristão. He goes and he joins in, and together they get a few more. Those Africans eventually go to Portugal. One of them happens to be of royal blood. He goes and says, listen, I am not supposed to be here. You guys should let me go. He's like, look, I'm so valuable that if I go back to the coastline, if you take me back home, they'll give you 10 of 10 in my place. So he's doing it first things first as self-defense. He wants to go back home, and he's like, hey, look, we'll give 10 in your place. So he eventually goes back. 10 of them go in his place. His family give 10 Africans in his place. And then the trade hasn't really started in earnest. But long story short, Tristão and Gonçalves continue around that region of what they call Western Sahara, Mauritania, Morocco area, that northwestern side of Africa. Not as far down as Senegal, but further north. And when they go there, they start. They eventually go and try and what's the word? They eventually go and try and capture people. They experience some resistance. There are a few battles that are being fought, but they eventually start bringing a few back. If you watched last week's live, I dealt with this in a bit more detail, but I don't want to spend too much time on it. But they were able to get, I think, on the second voyage, something like 200, 150 or 200 people that they were able to kidnap through fighting battles, etc. Sorry, no, about 45, then about 200. So in the end, what they did was they were realizing that these people at first, who they weren't treating as disrespectfully, but of course this is coinciding with, as the years are going by, this is coinciding with the period that the Moors are losing control in the Iberian Peninsula. So the Spanish Inquisition is just about to happen. Columbus is making his voyage to the Americas, and so they're like looking at it and they're saying, okay, look, we can use these Africans, we can help you. Some of these Africans can help us work on the land. But of course, they're also doing it with the indigenous people there as well as the Europeans. Okay. But ultimately, key point I want to highlight here is that the Africans ended up having to be super resourceful to survive. Some of them realized that these guys have superior weapons. We can't really fight them in the same way. So let's do a deal with them. Let's say, okay, instead of them taking us and our family, let's tell them that we'll go get people from other ethnic groups from somewhere in more inland. And so that's how that pretty much began. But the Europeans are the ones who first came. They didn't come to the coastline and meet Africans and did a deal with Africans. It wasn't Africans that called them over and said, Europeans, come and take us, come and take our people, or come and take this ethnic group or that ethnic group or that nationality. They literally just said, they literally came on a whim. And just to prove that they had been to a particular place, they said, let's kidnap a few and take it back to see our king. So that's how it started. Now, it is also the European that turned slavery, the concept of slavery, which had existed in history for many centuries, in fact, millennia maybe. They're the ones that changed it from what we would have called indentured servitude to chattel slavery. In other words, they're the ones who, it is them who, first of all, took the Native Americans. They used them to work the land in places like Haiti, places like South America, places like what would now be some of the colonies in the United States of America, and certainly in the Caribbean. They wiped out herds and herds of population because the work that they were doing was just not conducive to the physicalities of those people. But what they were finding is that the few Africans that they had there were outliving these people. Okay? But ultimately, they still said, okay, you know what? We have to make these people chattel. We have to treat them like chattel. We cannot afford to keep them as human beings. We cannot afford to allow them to think that they are human and they are equal to us. Otherwise, there will be uprisings, and uprisings they were. There are many examples of uprisings that occurred. I don't want to talk about them, but talk about all of them. But the successful ones are important. There's an image there, the bottom one, from Gaspar Yanga. I talked about this last week, I think. Gaspar Yanga led a successful rebellion in what would now be Mexico today, and that statue still exists of him. And you had many over the period of the whole enslavement. So we're talking about a 350, let's say from the year, actually no, so we're talking 1441 to, let's say, 1807 when it was officially abolished. So over that like 400-year period, 350-year period, you had numerous rebellions. Many of them were unsuccessful because, of course, when the British and the French came in, it became more of an industry. The Portuguese weren't very good at it, but when the British and the French got into it, it became more of an industry. And so they made sure that they had armies that would squash any sort of rebellion. But there were some successful ones. And of course, Gaspar Yanga, there was also one from a successful one in Suriname. You had all these maroon civilizations that were created in places like Jamaica, Dominican Republic, Cuba, where enslaved people would lead rebellions. Some of them were successful enough to run away, but some of them were captured, and ultimately slavery was remained in the island. But there were some small successes. Of course, in the United States, there were some minor successes in the 1800s. Nat Turner's rebellion, Denmark Vesey's rebellion, Gabriel Prosser's rebellion, Mark Delaney's rebellion. I mean, there were a few. They were momentarily successful, but they eventually quelled because the system was too powerful to allow it to go on. Okay, but ultimately, what I'm trying to point out here is that the indigenous people were killed off in many parts of the Americas. African people survived, so they had to be made chattel. Okay, and these rebellions became problematic because also what you have to think about is one of the gateways to the enslavement is they were bringing African people. Remember, Caribbean is the primary source. It's the center of sugar. It's where it's where African people were being brought to first. American colonies were being divided. They were divided into various regions. What we now call United States of America, for example, was divided into many places. So they'll come to the Caribbean and then they'll be distributed to different places. But what they were doing in the Caribbean in particular is they were bringing people from the same ethnic group. So imagine you're bringing 100 Yoruba people, and then in this place you bring 100 Congolese, 100 this, 100 that. And so they had the ability to communicate with each other. So these rebellions became a problem. And as soon as these rebellions, particularly the Haitian Revolution, which happens in late 1700s, when that one shuts down, when they realized that one was a problem, they said, okay, you know what? We can't keep bringing people from the same language group, same ethnicity, because they will eventually come together somehow. Okay, so Africans survived, so they had to be made chattel, and Africans were strong enough to fight back too. Okay, so the chattel thing became very important. Next slide. Now, one thing that's very important is that they altered their Bible to suit their point of view. And I want to emphasize this, but I think not enough of us know enough about Christianity. And I think this is where people like Ray Hagens are very important because they deal with scripture in particular. I think many historians talk about stuff around Christianity, but no, people don't actually go into what the texts say. The modern incarnation of the Bible that we have today is really the King James version of the Bible. It's the one that's probably the most dominant around the world. It's the one that we see in hotels, or if they still have them in hotels. I haven't really seen them in hotels that much, but it's the ones that are publicly used. King James version of the Bible, and then you have maybe like the Douay or the Catholic Bibles. Those Bibles are in the Catholic Church. But as far as Protestant people, the King James version is the dominant version of the Bible. We have to go into a little bit of history about who King James is in order to understand who he was. King James is the nephew, I believe, of Henry VIII. Nephew? Yeah, nephew. Henry VIII is the person who separates himself from the Catholic Church because he wants yet another divorce, and the Pope says no. Remember, the Catholic Church pretty much ruled religion or Christianity in Europe at that point. So he separates, goes to create the Church of England. Now, there's no text at that point. England is really controlling Scotland and Wales and Ireland. So it's not really dealing with any major colonies at that point. So when he instigates the Church of England, obviously later down the line, it creates a problem in Northern Ireland and Republic of Ireland, and they eventually split because of dogmatic issues regarding Christianity. But that's another story. But anyway, so it's not until King James that we start to see a script being created. Now, King James is a good friend of Shakespeare, William Shakespeare. In fact, William Shakespeare wrote several books. I think even Macbeth is sort of loosely based off King James, loosely based. It's not exactly. But Shakespeare was a good friend living at the same time as him. This is the 1500s and the early 1600s. So what happens is he calls a conference at a place called Hampton Court. Hampton Court is a place in southwest of London, near Surrey. It's a very big building called Hampton Court. A conference was called there in the year 1604. Very, very important conference if you want to understand the history of our Christianity and how Christianity became this King James version. Now, a few years before that, remember, you have Martin Luther, who goes and starts the Reformation. Martin Luther is the guy who Martin Luther King is named after. He goes and starts the Reformation, which starts to see people look away from the Catholic Church and all their like sinful ways, etc. Sankara, good to see you, by the way. So Hampton Court Conference happens, and he gets all the best scholars, the theologians, writers of his time. They all get together, take the various versions of the Bible, and put them together in what they call the King James Version. Now, King James, obviously, he's obsessed with the darkness too. I think there's a book they made about him called about demonology. And in fact, when you look at the story of Macbeth, it's a very like dark character and so on. So King James Version is also a homosexual. He's also known to have been having to sleep with his, when he sleeps with a man, he could have them killed. Very, very psycho. Him, Elizabeth I did something similar with her lovers too. Psycho people. But anyway, the King James Version of the Bible is written more as a commemoration to him in his honor, because he called this conference. And it's even said that William Shakespeare is involved in writing the book of Psalms, book of Proverbs. He's involved in writing those too. But I think there's some scriptures that we need to understand. Let me just highlight this for you. There's some scriptures I think we all need to read as Black people to understand how they brought in, because this is the year 1604. This is a good 150 years after slavery began. So imagine that's 6 or 7 generations later. So slavery is well on its way. The Hampton Court Conference. You can't see me, can you? Oh no, that's not what I want. Yeah. Okay, so so a couple of scriptures that we need to look at. Songs of Solomon, verses 1, verses 5 to 6. Now, this is the one where, if you remember the Queen of Sheba or Queen Makeda, it's really Empress of Sheba, Queen Makeda, whatever you want to call her. The Cushite queen, where there's the scripture where she's like, I am black, but I am beautiful. This is a different version that says, dark I am, yet lovely. In other words, it's already creating this stigma about being dark. Okay, now she's one of the few historical figures in the Old Testament of the Bible that we can turn to. There's also Tahaka. There's also Queen Makeda, Tahaka, and then of course they talk about Cush, they talk about Kemet, and it's kind of generic version for the Black land as Ethiopia. Book of Deuteronomy 28 verse 68, which says, and the Lord will bring you back in ships to Egypt, a journey that I promised that you should never make again, and there you shall offer yourselves to sale to your enemies as male and female slaves, but there will be no buyer. Okay. There are also scriptures that I couldn't find all of them. I sort of put this thing together in a haste, but there are also scriptures where in the Old Testament where it says you cannot come into the presence of the Lord if you have a wide nose. I will send ships to take care of the careless Ethiopians. Ethiopians is a generic term for Black people. Deuteronomy 28, 48, 50. Therefore you shall serve your enemies whom the Lord will send against you in hunger, in thirst, in nakedness, and lacking everything. And he will put a yoke of iron on your neck until he has destroyed you. The Lord will bring a nation against you from far away, from the end of the earth, swooping down like the eagle, a nation whose language you do not understand, a hard-faced nation who shall not respect the old or show mercy to the young. Now, these are very, people will want to say that these are very dubious, but I think you have to look at the scripture from the point of view, if you look at the Bible from the point of view of history, the Old Testament was written after the New Testament in terms of historically. The Bible itself is not a book that's put together based on any sort of eyewitness accounts or anything. It was put together at the various ecumenical councils, which I think we talked about in a previous live. But bottom line is they altered the Bible to suit their POV. And even then, the scriptures that were being given to so-called slave masters to allow that they allowed their so-called slaves to read or understand were things about slavery, slave obey your master, etc., etc. Okay, so the European loved slavery so much that he started it. He realized that he had to keep this enslaved person enslaved, and so made them chattel. And he even got a scripture, a book of faith, to highlight this point, so that the people felt that somehow this is what they deserved. Now, the rebellions part and the abolitionists. The abolitionists are the ones who take the biggest rap for freeing the slaves. You know, they say the Quakers. If you live in England, there's the William Wilberforces of the world. There's what's his name? John. What's his name? I forget his name now. This guy in America who fought. Anyway, long story short, Quakers. There's an image there you see of the Quakers, and the image before is from the movie Amazing Grace, which is about William Wilberforce and Gustavus Vasa, the African slave, how they came together and eventually came with the petitioned Parliament to emancipate the African slaves in 1807. Okay, now the rebellions were first. Okay, as I said before, the Maroon communities, they in the Gaspayangas, places like Dominican Republic, they had a rebellion on Christmas Day in 1521. These are earlier on. But later on, these numerous Maroon communities would be created in parts of the Caribbean, in parts of the Americas, in Suriname, as I mentioned. So African people were really fighting to liberate themselves, right? Really, really fighting to liberate themselves in the Americas. In some cases, it was detrimental because some of them would launch guerrilla warfare. Some of them partnered up in places like the United States, towards the South. They partnered up with some Native American tribes or ethnic groups, and would go and destabilize some plantations. But of course, the abolitionists, and we have to give them some credit, people like William Wilberforce, etc., and not just William Wilberforce, certainly the petitions, the various petitions by people, because you see, the enslavement of African people, any fair-minded person at some point realized this thing is just, there's nothing right about it. But people sort of program their minds to think that this is how it should be. These people are meant to be slaves, etc. But they realize, I mean, you can't say an African woman is 3/5 of a human being, or that she's not a human being. You can't call her livestock and then go sleep with her, because what does that make you? Sarah Hemings and you see with the founding fathers, Benjamin Franklin and John Quincy Adams and all these people, right? Like, had issue, George Washington as well. They had sexual relations with Black people, had children with Black people. So at the end of the day, if these people are beneath you, why should you sleep with them? What would it make you? So ultimately, this thing, they realized that it wasn't right. But also, I think it's important to mention that there were white people who saw this and said, you know what? It's the way it is. There were a few that said, let's do something about it. And there's certainly, and there's a documentary made by what's her name? This English lady, Emancipated, I think. Samuel Jackson's documentary. I think it's called Emancipated. It's like a 2 or 3 part series where they go into detail. They talk about the various petitions in places like Bristol, parts of England where where people actually signed petitions and say we need, and hundreds of thousands of people actually signed and said this thing needs to end. Of course, these people are not the ones going on the boats and doing all the capturing. They're the ones who live far, far away. And anyway, long story short, the abolitionists obviously play a vital role, but I think the biggest catalyst is the French Revolution. Now, the French Revolution, why I say it's the biggest catalyst is because the French Revolution and the Haitian Revolution happened within a few years of each other. So 1776, you have the US Revolution. 1789, you have the Bastille Day thing, which happens in France, where the people go and storm the Bastille. Because remember, there's a class problem. There's a class issue that's being waged in Europe. Places like France, places like England. Class is a big issue. So this whole idea of chattel slavery, it may have been new to us in Africa, but to lower class, working class Europeans, this was pretty much like the norm. Like, if you were lower than the middle class, so-called middle class, you were pretty much a slave. You were chattel. You worked the land for them. You fought for them in battle if you had to, etc. So nobility was crucial. So they go to the Bastille, storm the Bastille, start the French Revolution, 1789. Now the French Revolution is taking place, and then the Haitian Revolution is sort of happening at the same time, at least the initial spark. with Macandal, who's the what they call witch doctor, and then eventually Toussaint Louverture and Jean-Jacques Dessalines, and then eventually it becomes successful. And of course, by the year 1807, Napoleon eventually says, okay, we put an end to slavery. Coincidentally, 1798, Napoleon goes to Egypt and sees that all these black people were the ones who created this great civilization. In fact, he's with a man called Count de Volney, Constantine de Volney, who basically goes there as a racist, and then when he sees the Sphinx, Horemaket, which is the name of the Sphinx, he sees the Sphinx and he says, I cannot believe that these black people, the object of our scorn, the people who we've treated badly, etc. I'm paraphrasing, are the people that we own all our arts and cultures, all our arts and culture and everything to. He even goes to say that it's incredible that we who call ourselves do-gooders, etc., we will actually enslave people, but really the black man is equal to the white man. This is what he says on his trip in 1798 with Napoleon. And then people, of course, rumor that this is where he shot off the nose of the Sphinx. So it's pretty interesting that all these things are happening within about 10 or 20 years of each other. And of course, don't get it twisted. People in America are aware of this too. In fact, they deliberated. Remember when they're signing the U.S. Constitution, it takes like 52 days. And then they end up coming up with this 2 or 3 pages about, they deliberate for days about whether this whole thing about liberty is associated to everybody. But really, the US is designed for Protestant males, people fleeing the oppression of Protestants in Europe. So essentially, that's who it's designed for. So when they say liberty and justice for all, they're really talking about white males who fit Protestant ideology, not Catholics, not Jews, not women, not black people, not anybody. So that's ultimately what the US Constitution was designed for. So even though they know what is going on around the world, they're like, it cannot extend here because the racism is that much more entrenched. All right, let me move on. So the abolition thing happens. And okay, I won't deal with all of them because everybody dealt with abolition a different way, but I'll just highlight the main points. So abolition in itself doesn't stop anything from happening. It's just more of a paying lip service thing. And they were very slick with the way they created the laws. For example, Britain, their first kind of abolition law happened in the 1700s, about 1706, where they said that anybody who manages to flee, any black person that flees from slavery and lands in Britain is technically free. But then there was this word that they used, this terminology that they said that they may be free, but they're not quite free. They're still under the control of Britain, but they're not. They're free from slavery. So it's a weird law. Of course, 1807, 1825, 1833, different amendments to this thing are happening. But ultimately, abolition didn't mean anything. And I want this to be to be highlighted. 1/4 of the Africans that were taken between the years 1507 and 1870, so 25% of the Africans taken from Africa were taken after 1807. So this William Wilberforce character here from this movie Amazing Grace at the bottom, all the work that he did, 1/4 of the Africans were taken after this period. Now, of course, the period before 1807 is 300 plus years, in fact, close to 400 years. So 400 years pass, and 75% of the people who were taken are gone, but 25% are taken in the few years after, in the 60 or 70 years after where it continued. So it's incredible. It's quite incredible. It's easier to say that more Africans were taken than any other year prior to that after the abolition. Now, so you have different anti-slavery groups that are sort of coming up in places like Britain. They're signing laws with places like Portugal, telling them that, you cannot continue on the coastline of Africa. British ships, so different laws are coming in. One says that British ships should go off the coast of West Africa and go and block anybody who's trying to take African slaves. or take Africans as slaves. In fact, the image that you see there is from the film Amistad. If you know anything about the movie Amistad, you have Sinke, who comes from what would be Sierra Leone today. Sierra Leone, he's basically captured, and he's basically captured. Sorry, him and his people are captured. They're taken on a boat. They manage to rebel on the boat, have a mutiny, if you will, kill the ship's captain, and they sail into the United States of America. And then the film is all about them being going to court to prove that they were not enslaved people. And the reason why that happens is because the law at the time, what was actually happening is you had private. So when Elizabeth comes into the slave trade, it's about commerce of the nation. When the abolition happens around 1807, between 1807 and 1845, it's about nobody else but individuals. So those individual contractors will work for the UK government, go and feed the plantations. The trade was still very much going on. So the Amistad case was very unique because, not unique, because actually, yeah, it was unique because in that it was one of the few instances where the Africans were able to prove that, look, we shouldn't have been taken in the first place. And they managed to, the story is they were able to go back to where they came from. Okay. But France, so it ends, let me just put this back up for you. So France, it ends 1815, under Napoleon. He calls an end to it. This is 17 years after he goes to Egypt. So he goes to Egypt 1798. And then, of course, so France gets rid of theirs around 1815. Then the US Civil War. Now, the US Civil War takes place in the 1860s. I think we have to be very, very ignorant to think that the US, the North and South, went to war over Black people. They won't fight for 4 years, dying and bleeding for Black people. It's just, I think, or for African people. I think this is where our education, we need to start scrutinizing our education. What makes these people who, as soon as the emancipation happens and the Africans fled to the North and experienced, I won't say worse, but experienced a lot of discrimination in the North, why is it that you would assume that those people who so-called fought for you, why should they discriminate you? Surely they should love you and welcome you with open arms. But we allow our history to be taught to us, and that's the problem. Okay? Really, they didn't fight for us. They were really fighting a battle over the cotton gin. You see, the South was agrarian, the North was part of the Industrial Revolution, and the two of them conflicted. South wanted to remain agrarian, farmland, plantation, and the invention of the cotton gin was going to revolutionize the world. In fact, cotton and the invention of cotton and creating of clothing, places like Manchester in Britain, even in Africa, by the way. But the invention of the cotton gin meant that the work of a slave was unnecessary, right? Now, so anyway, but this is not as important as it needs to be. But ultimately, they didn't go to war in the U.S. Civil War for the sake of Black people. They went because it was a difference in ideology between North and South. In Brazil, it happens a little bit later, around the 1880s. Cuba is one of the very, very last places in 1890. Now, of course, if it's happening in 1880 and 1890, US obviously is not a destination for enslaved African people. Most of the Caribbean isn't. Most of South America isn't. So ultimately, Brazil and Cuba, or at least in the case of Cuba, is a unique place. So what's actually happening is Africans are still being taken from the Bight of Benin, what they call the Bight of Benin, around the area of Nigeria, the Guinea coast, so where Dahomey was. They're still going there and taking people. So literally, if I'm born in the 1990s, 100 years before I was born, people were still being captured from Africa and taken to the Americas. So it was really, really still happening. And what's even scarier is that the emancipation of African people never, ever happened anywhere. But I'll deal with that in a second. Ultimately, they kept going to Africa and intercepting ships. And in some cases, when they capture a ship, when they capture a ship full of Africans, it's not as if they repatriate them back to Africa. They'll take them to another place. They'll take them to Cuba. They'll take them to Brazil, etc. Okay, so make no mistake, emancipation, Europeans freed the Africans. I mean, I've already brought up 5 different arguments to explain why they never did. Now, next point. The evolution of slavery in the Americas. Slavery just evolved. Slavery. Oh, Victoria Kimuyu, good to see you. Sankara, good to see you. Uh, so slavery never stopped. Never really stopped. I don't. For those of you in the United States, you already know about the 13th Amendment. If these amendments mattered, then there'll be no need to. Sorry, if slavery was really over, there'll be no need to continually amend things. But anyway, that's not important. Slavery just evolved. In the images that you see, look at the bottom image. You see four young black men, boys really, dressed in prison uniform. So really what happened was we went from, and obviously you know about Juneteenth, when Abraham Lincoln declares that the war is over, and essentially that Africans are free. Many Africans in parts of the South didn't even know they were free and remained on the plantation, kept working. And of course, Juneteenth becomes an important celebration because that's the day that they realize, oh my God, we're free. And now we can, what do we do now? But ultimately, those who remained got caught up in the same people who were bitter about losing a war, bitter about the fact that during the, what's the terminology? During that the war is now over, in many cases, black people, in some counties, some areas, black people outnumber white people, and those black people ultimately, start to go into crucial parts of government, and then the resentment starts. KKK starts to form as a result. But ultimately, long story short, is that these people start to feel the resentment. So how are they going to live with these black people? And so the convict leasing, antebellum South, in the antebellum South, exactly. So eventually the convict leasing system starts, which is essentially a form of enslavement. Convict leasing eventually leads to what eventually goes, these old slave catchers become a version of police, and the convict leasing system eventually becomes the prison industrial complex much later on. Okay, I'm highlighting things, so some people might want to add more in their own time, but we're getting to a final point. Akwasi Bona, thank you very much, appreciate that. Okay, so this is also the time where the myth about the terminology Africans sold Africans starts to come in. You see, because what do you do to a poor, uneducated class of millions of people? And keep in mind, again, in many parts of the South, African people outnumbered white people or so-called European people, right? Or American people. They outnumbered them. So when they were, so part of the issue was now, okay, they outnumber us, we have to keep them in check, we have to keep them in line. And part of what we do, especially when we give them an education, in places like Britain, the Education Act comes in the 1880s, where they start to make education really mandatory. Same thing's happening in the Americas. We have to educate these people. So what do we do? What do we tell them about Africa? We don't tell them Africa is a great place. We tell them Africa and sold Africans. This is where the whole cannibalist theory comes in. And 2 or 3 decades later, Hollywood takes it to another level. This is also a time where they come up with the theme that Africa is poor. And it's true. Africa suddenly goes from this land of fertility and greenery, even though we'd been losing our, I always call this the first brain drain. The enslavement of African people was the first brain drain. But even though we'd been losing our biggest, our brightest, we still had remnants of great civilizations. Certainly, when you look in the poverty that exists now, it's really a problem of land. People have no land. They go and live in shanty towns and so on. But people all had a place to live. The communal aspect of society was still there at the time. But in America, they're educating African people to think, oh no, you come from a people who are poor, they're uneducated, they're cannibals, they eat each other. Not completely untrue, because we weren't going to school in the same way that people around the world were going to school, but certainly we had a form of education. But what is going on in Africa is juxtaposed against what's going on in America. But I'll come to Africa in a second. The next thing, if you look at the image, and I just want you to see this image very clearly, this top left image, that's from The Godfather Part 2. If you remember The Godfather Part 2, that's the one where you see the young Vito Corleone coming from Sicily to Ellis Island. He sees the big Statue of Liberty, ironically, and he comes to start his new life. This is also the period, so this is in the early 1900s. This is also the period where, if you know the Titanic, 1912, it's sailing from Liverpool to the Americas. You have a lot of these people coming to the Americas. Now, what was actually happening? They weren't coming because they wanted to go and invest or they have savings. Europe essentially dumped their worst people in North and South America. And I don't mean that as an insult. Their working class, the people who were poor, the people who were the underclasses of society. And I want this to be made absolutely clear, because make no mistake, you go to a place, I live in London, for example, in a city like London, around this same period, around the period where the enslavement of Africans is going on, in London, there's a thing called the great stink of London, where the living conditions are so disgusting that people were dumping refuse in the Thames. This is one of the greatest cities in the world, right? Where the stock exchange is, basically the cradle of the enslavement, the wealthiest place in the world, really up until the 1940s. But its people lived in absolute squalor. You've heard of stories about Jack the Ripper and so on. People lived in absolute squalor. So they opened up the places in the Americas, realized we have an overwhelmingly black population here. And ultimately, what will they do? They will mix with the population, and before we know it, this black population will overrun us, right? There's a good movie called Quemada with Marlon Brando about a slave rebellion that took place in some fictional island in the Caribbean. But it's very interesting to see the black people, the Africans are the ones who fight the rebellion, defeats the European, and then the mulattoes take over power. You look in Jamaica, Manly is basically a white man, but he's a mulatto in their eyes. So ultimately, the lighter skinned people realize we have to hold on. So let's open up the doors and bring white people in. And that's where you get all these Italians coming to Brazil, Italians coming to Argentina. The footballer Lionel Messi is Italian. These are Italian people that go and emigrate to Argentina. Italians go and emigrate to places like Barcelona, to Brazil. English people, Scottish people, Portuguese people, Irish people. This whole Irish, Boston, Massachusetts thing. These are Irish immigrants have only been there 120 years in the Americas. They start to come in. That's why when you watch a lot of those old gangster films from the 1920s, James Cagney and so on, they would always say that if you look up their parents are direct immigrants from Europe, escaping the pogroms of the Holocaust, not the Holocaust, but the Jewish oppression that's going on in places like Russia, etc. And they keep coming to the point where in places like Dominican Republic, they tried to wipe out the black population. They bring a whole bunch of Spaniards. They still refer to Spain as the homeland. Various other places. They just basically, and of course, United States, of course, the big one, they open up the doors to these poor white people. Of course, these poor white people come over. And now all of a sudden, 200 years, 150 years later, 100 years later, really, this black population that really should have taken a step further and really been the dominant race in the Americas is now a minority. Is still a minority. And so that's also pretty interesting. Yes, Lizzie, good to see you, Lizzie. Long time. Irish potato famine is happening at this point. So Irish people, and of course, the Irish thing is also very crucial. Irish people are, if you even watch the movie Braveheart, they're always, if you look in the whole spectrum of Britain, United Kingdom and Northern Ireland is what we call the United Kingdom today, but what you call the empire is run by England, essentially. The Isles run by England. The Irish are the underclass, and those Irish were brought during the enslavement, but they also were the ones who fled. Again, if you watch the movie Titanic, they're leaving from Liverpool, but they're Irishmen. They're people. They're people from all over the world who are running away to try and flee the oppression that's going on in Europe, but also to try and earn. Okay, so the United States is essentially created for Protestant males, free Protestant males, but later on it opens the door to poor working class people from Europe. Nya, you asked the question, can you repeat the slave rebellion movie name, please? It's called Quemada or Burn. It's by a Italian filmmaker called Gillo Pontecorvo. I'll put it in the chat. Quemada. So it's a film by Gillo Pontecorvo, starring Marlon Brando. It's probably the most fascinating movie if you want to understand the politics of the Caribbean. at least up until the 1960s. It's different now. But up until the 1960s, when you see Bob Marley going and holding Manly's hand and and I forget the other guy's name, you're seeing two men who are classified as mulatto, but to you and I, they're white people. So it's about understanding how that politics happens. Anyway, so the whitenizing of the Americas happens, and Europe essentially goes and dumps its worst in North and South America. But also, what happens as an evolution of the slave trade? Obviously, we know about the compensation that was given to the French government over a period of 150 years to compensate for the losses they had in the island of Hispaniola, in particular Haiti, when the Haitians fought the rebellion and managed to overthrow the French. Now, that is also very interesting. It's a very interesting point because the Haitians agreed to pay it because really they need the blockade. They couldn't survive without the blockade, but really they could. But anyway, we're not here to talk about Haiti. But ultimately, there was a compensation to a government, essentially. The British as well, when they decided we're going to end slavery, the numerous times that they decided to compensate the families. Families like William Gladstone, the prime minister that sends General Gordon into Sudan to fight against the Mahdi in the late 1880s, and various others, even people that exist today. There's even a database that they've put up, I think as of 2016, of all the families that exist in the UK who profited from the slave trade. And many of them would like to say, oh, we gave our money away. But really, at this point in time, there's still people who benefit from it. But long story short, they compensated individuals. In the case of the UK, it was up to 40% of the annual treasury income. So about 20 million in that time. So that would be what? UK economy is pretty big. In the billions, they took a 40% chunk of the annual budget, if you will, to pay off individuals for the enslavement. So really, the Europeans didn't end anything. Now, let's move on. I'm coming up to the end soon. Now, what was going on in Africa? Because it's very important. Many of us are misinformed. Many of us like to think that it's just kind of us and them thing. But really, what is going on with African people worldwide? It always parallels somehow. It may look different, but it's always happening. It's always happening. They're always juxtaposed. They're always happening side by side. For a start, like our brothers and sisters in the Americas, there was a forced Christianization of Africans. If you watch my documentary, Voodoo in Togo, I go into detail about this. We have a system of indirect rule, okay, which comes as a result of numerous wars that are being fought. Because again, I talked about this in previous. And Sega was born in Boston, by the way. Ironic, yeah. Edward Sega. That good point, Lizzie. But the indirect rule comes as the missionary system comes in, and the missionaries essentially create a gateway, a pathway into the land. And then numerous stories, and I think I've done a video about this as well. We've done a live on this, where the missionaries create the pathway for the Europeans to come in, find the roots, and eventually go in and conquer. What also happens is the missionaries were there sort of gingering, as it's saying we have in Nigeria. They gingered them. They gingered the locals to be on their side, and they granted them small land here and there. Meanwhile, the missionaries were feed back into the governments, and eventually these people came in and conquered. And what they did is they basically exiled a lot of the rulers that were useful, and the ones that they could get on side, they kept them in power and had this thing called indirect rule. So that's why if you go to West Africa today, you will still find many monarchs. They still exist. They're powerless, essentially. I mean, they have minor power, but for the most part, the ones who meant something to the people who were ultimately fighting the wars against the Europeans, those people were either exiled or killed or replaced. In the case of Dahomey, and people don't like Dahomey a lot. The woman king is just, and that's why I think this whole thing is so important that we study ourselves, like, because you think history is just black and white. It's never like that. It's always nuanced. In the case of Dahomey, there were two wars that were being fought between the French and the Dahomey. They fought two wars in the late 1800s. Two wars. So the Dahomey obviously meant what they were doing is they were pushing people back. They were pushing them back. Eventually, the French get in. Ironically, they were led by a mixed race commander, a man called Alfred Dodds. A mixed race commander is the one who goes in with a lot of black troops, actually. Black troops called the Tirailleurs from France. These were the red cap soldiers from Senegal. But anyway, so the colonialism in Africa created Europeanized Africans in the same way that the period after the enslavement created sort of Americanized Africans. And last week, the point I was trying to emphasize is, when did you stop being Africans? When did Americans stop being Africans? When did African Americans go from being African to being African Americans or black or Negro, whatever? And really, this is the point where we start to see the change, because they're stuck in a place. This is the place that's educated them. And ultimately, this is the place that the only place they call home, because of the lack of education that existed. And so because of this is when Africans go from being African to being American. Okay, and so this is where we're seeing. But conversely, what's going on in Europe, this is when what's going on in Africa? Africans stop being African mentally. You see, they're still on the soil, so they can still claim African. In the same way in the Americas, you're still black, so you can still claim African. But both of us have our minds twisted. We're trying to be like Europeans, and Africans in America are trying to be like Americans. In fact, you go and see them pushing, Booker T. Washington pushing, sort of writing all these articles saying, you know what, Africans we should go and fight. We should go and fight in the First World War. We should go and fight in the Second World War, saying it's our duty as Americans. So you start to see this kind of desire to be American, and then in the case of Africans, it's a desire to be European. And this is where the period of negritude, Negritude. Frantz Fanon is a very good writer from the Caribbean. He talks about this thing called negritude. W.E.B. Du Bois and so on. Good point, Sankara. Thank you. We never stop being African. Exactly. So this is really the point I'm trying to make, is the Africanization, they really Europeanized the African and they Americanized the African. Okay, so two things are happening at two different places. To the point where, in the case of the European, if we still haven't been convinced that they actually haven't ended slavery, what they went and did is they went and established, this is a little bit before, they go and establish colonies in West Africa, Liberia and Sierra Leone. And the outcomes of those two places are for everybody to see. But the idea was, you have these Americanized African people from the United States, these Americanized African people from the Caribbean, who are being sent to Sierra Leone and Liberia. In particular, let's just focus on Liberia for now, to go and civilize the African. Okay, so the theory of the European is, okay, ultimately it's, let's go civilize them for the sake of us. So you see President Monroe, what's the man, Russworm, and in fact John Brown Russworm. If you see the image, let me just show it to you. So the images I've put there, by the way, I didn't explain the images. So the guys at the bottom with the red hats, those are the tirailleurs. These are the Senegalese soldiers. They really were the ones that were involved in all of France's dirty work in West Africa in terms of beating these great African civilizations or empires. The top left is from a movie called Heritage Africa. And I want to emphasize that you guys watch this film. Heritage Africa is a Ghanaian film. It's really about the biggest Uncle Tom you've ever seen in Africa. So it takes place in Ghana around the period where the colonial age is going on, 1940s, I think, 1950s. And it's about this guy who really is trying his best to be a European, to the point where he changes his name to sound English. I mean, it's an incredible film. But in the end, he comes good. But anyway, John Brown Russworm, top right, is sent to be the governor of Liberia by President Monroe. They go and name the capital of that area of Liberia. Remember, they get a small enclave, by the way. It's not like they have the whole country. But they managed to go and acquire some land in Liberia. They named the city Monrovia after President Monroe. The capital of Liberia is called Monrovia after President Monroe. So that's pretty interesting. You have essentially people going to do the dirty work of the European in Africa and civilize the African, to the point where they thought that these African people need us. What they don't know is these Africans on the coastline in places like Liberia, places like Sierra Leone, are descendants of the people who were from Songhai. So if anything, they were the most civilized Africans you could find. The Songhai Empire, if you know anything about the Songhai Empire and what it was able to do in the world, probably the most civilized black people that existed at that time. So the irony, the lack of history, lack of information, and the arrogance of Christianity and the European is that these African people from the Americas who are Americanized can go to Liberia and try and civilize these Africans. Same thing in Sierra Leone. These Europeanized African people could be sent to Sierra Leone and create civilized Africans. And of course, it massively backfired. Because what is the result of these things? The results today, and let me just show you this. Civil wars in Liberia and Sierra Leone. For those of you who are around my age, if you were born in the 80s, you would have been aware of the child soldiers thing, the whole child soldiers thing, which really starts from the 1980s. You have a war in Sierra Leone, and then eventually a war in Liberia that really lasts for nearly 15 years, 15, 20 years, really. A war over diamonds. But the catalyst for this war is the problem that was created when John B. Russwurm was sent to this guy, the guy in the top right, when John B. Russwurm was sent over along with a bunch of liberated African people who were educated in the American system to go and civilize these Africans in Liberia. And it creates a problem because what they start to do is they start to separate from the African. We're better than you, okay? This is not me trying to create xenophobic issues. I'm just pointing out the facts. They came there with a superior mindset created by the European. And the European goes and says, okay, you guys, we will back you. To the point where in the war in Liberia, even with all the child soldiers, it was really a war about diamonds. And the diamonds were being supplied, the weapons were being supplied by, through proxies, but from the US. Don't forget, this is the period of the Iran-Contra. Iran-Contra, of course, if you know anything about that, it's the drugs that are being brought in from South America, South and Central America, in order to give the Shah of Iran weapons so he could fight his war. So they were also doing a similar thing. This is also the period of American post-Vietnam. America is going to places like El Salvador, doing their thing, going as crazy as they can to try and kill this so-called Cold War thing. But also in Africa, they're like, oh, we got to keep an eye on those diamonds. And so, of course, Liberia is a very important place. But what happens is, and I was going to show you a very graphic image of what happened. You had this thing that aired on TV. The president, Samuel Doe, who is more indigenous. Samuel Doe was overthrown. And by the way, Samuel Doe, he may have been indigenous, but him too, he was pretty despotic himself. He did some horrible things. But there was the reason why this is important is there's a president called Kevin Prince Johnson. He later became president, but he came, overthrew the government, and they literally took Samuel K. Doe, and on public TV, you could probably find it on YouTube still, they publicly cut off his ears, right? Cut out his eyes. I mean, this is on live TV. It aired on TV around the world. And Kevin Prince Johnson has never been brought to The Hague. Not that I'm saying that the US is supposed to be our judge, but because he was backed by the US, the man became a born-again Christian, and he's still running around Liberia today. But anyway, he was the person who eventually took over power from Samuel K. Doe. So it just shows you the problems that were created because the Europeans still maintain this form of slavery over African people, that they can go and create these schisms amongst us. And it's, we talked about the FBA and ADOS. This is just another version of it. The Europeans, engrossing our minds, forcing us to look at each other rather than look at them. Okay, and it's a very intelligent thing. We also saw the systematic assassinations and defamations of Pan-African leaders, both in Africa and the Caribbean. You see, post-slavery, I think the worst thing that happened is the destruction of our leadership. So, of course, we know the situation with Kwame Nkrumah. Even when you go and look at the people that he supported up north, Ben Bella in Algeria, Gamal Abdel Nasser of Egypt, even though they weren't black people, they still recognized this Pan-African ideology. Of course, when the war with Israel came about, Nasser and the people in the north focused on, Palestine. But ultimately, south of the Sahara, the African people, any sort of leaders that were significant to us had no major backers. So they were murdered. I think I have an image. So there you have Patrice Lumumba. Patrice Lumumba, the bottom right. He goes and speaks at the Independence Day celebration. And of course, that signs his death warrant. There's the guy with the red beret in the middle on the left there, Thomas Sankara. Thomas Sankara is probably the leader that I think most African Americans, if you want to find out somebody who's similar to, like, if you want to find out a movement that was similar to Black Panther Party, and this isn't a movement because this is ultimately a government. He overthrew the leadership, the corrupt leadership, and basically created a stable socialist government in Burkina Faso for about 3 or 4 years before he was removed. I went to Burkina Faso a few years ago, and seeing what they did to his grave is shocking. But this guy was eventually murdered by his best friend, who was financed by the French government. I mean, it's just this horrible, horrible story. But they got rid of all our leaders, and of course, there's Malcolm X there on the top right. So the systematic assassination and defamation of our leaders who were Pan-African in thought, and this happens right across the Caribbean. This happens in the USA, of course. This happens in South America. Then we see neocolonialism come in a different form. The Structural Adjustment Program, SAP, look it up if you're curious. Structural Adjustment Program with the World Bank is when they go and basically they give out these ridiculous loans to countries in the Caribbean, in Africa, and they basically say that we're gonna devalue your currency. And so this is when you start to see the big brain drains. And I talked about this a few weeks ago. This is the period of the 1970s, 80s, where you start seeing African families move to Europe, go and do all these odd jobs in Europe. So many of us who live in Europe today, I mean, I came to Europe myself. My parents live in Africa, but my wife's parents, for instance, this is the generation that is moving to Europe, to France, to Germany, to England, to go and make a better life for themselves. Essentially going and creating more Europeanized African people. Okay. Now, this is also the period, unfortunately, where Africans in America start to look at Africa, because again, now you're watching the TV and even the image of Africa, never mind what you knew before. Because again, remember, the period of enslavement, even after enslavement, you still have things like AME Church, African Methodist Episcopal. So you're still recognizing yourself as Africans. When the period of war is going on between Haile Selassie and Mussolini in Italy, African Americans are volunteering themselves to go over to Africa and fight for Haile Selassie. Haile Selassie is obviously very influential in the Caribbean too, but there was still a sense of Africanness. But by the time the 1970s, 1980s comes about, when the Black Panther movement is destroyed, the Malcolm X's, all these people linking African Americans back to Africa, when they are killed, this is when this whole Africans in America begin to ridicule Africans Africans in America begin to ridicule Africans in Africa, because the images you're seeing of Africa, and this isn't just you, this is even Africans that grew up in the Caribbean, first generation, second generation that grew up in England, sorry. You're watching the TV and the images you see of Africa are not very good. So this is where the African booty scratcher context comes in. It's funny because I have a good friend called Obadele Kambon. I'm going to talk about him in a bit, actually. But anyway, he's American-born Black person. I grew up in America, but his parents were Pan-African in thought. His father is Kamal Kambon, very great leader, contemporary of the John Henry Clarks. And he named his children African names. But this Obadele Kambon, was ridiculed in school because of his name, even though he was an American kid. He was as American as most kids there. But it just goes to show you how these issues start to be created. Now the Africans are coming over to Europe and they're having issues with the Caribbeans. Certainly when you look at the 1970s, 1980s, we have issues with each other. Caribbean people, even really up until the early 2000s, African people from the Caribbean and African people from Africa in Europe are fighting each other. So all these issues are being created, but we don't realize that we're just pawns on a chessboard. We are puppets being controlled by a master puppeteer who has never ended slavery. Okay? And then, of course, the theory is Africans are going to give themselves a better life in Europe. And the top image, which is probably the most recent image, this one over here, is of African migrants going and risking their lives, going through the Mediterranean, going through the Sahara Desert, and then trying to go through the Mediterranean and get to Europe and go and live under bridges in France, go and live in tents made out of paper in Calais in order to try and get to England. All of these things we fail to realize are part of slavery. It's not just a slavery mentality anymore. It's to understand that not just that the Europeans didn't end slavery, they never have. See, we have to start looking at things in reality. They never ended it. Everything has been amended. And I think anybody who hasn't watched this live from the beginning, go to the beginning when it's over and just watch it so that you understand some of the points I'm making. Now, because I'm about solutions, how do we go forward? And I think going forward has to be where everybody comes to. And I think there's no point engaging online if we're not engaging on how to go forward. And me, I'm sorry I sound like a broken record, but I think we have to understand that we are the same people. Where am I? We have to understand that we are the same people. We are the same people. We have slight differences, cultural differences. But you see, the thing with cultural differences is they can change in just one generation. You see, if you take the story of an enslaved African person who comes to America, how long before they lose their African roots? Well, really, the African roots don't leave them until they die. But if their child is born in that civilization, even though they might tell them little bits and bobs, that civilization ultimately is their parent, and it's who raises them. But us now, we have the power to be able to go and live anywhere in the world we want. We have the power to educate our children in any way we want. And ultimately, one generation, we can transform this completely. My brother, Dr. Kambon, I was just talking about a minute ago, he moved to Ghana in the year 2008. And in 2008, he started having a family. All his children have Ghanaian names. They're really raised as Ghanaians. So in one generation, we can transform ourselves completely. I think the thing we need to also remember is that our enemies have had a 400-year-old head start. A 400-year head start on all of us. Because at the time that they were looking at us as black, we were just looking at us we were just looking at each other as my town, my village, my settlement, my city, my empire, not as a collective people. And I always talk about this. I talked about this in my documentary, The Dahomey Kingdom. It's not until we find ourselves on ships that we realize that we are black. Because at that point, we are not looking at each other in that sense. And again, I have to emphasize this. I sound like a broken record, but travel. Anyway, travel is one of my points, but let me move on. I think the other thing that we have to do in order to go forward, because I've been, just seeing how people are reacting to some of my videos, but also to not just some of my videos, but to, a lot of other people who are talking about the same sort of thing, is I think what we fail to understand is the continent will always be home. The continent has to always be home. Marcus Garvey says, I will never give up an island for a continent. That's what Marcus Garvey said. The best organizer of the 20th century, the best black organizer we've ever had, really, in history. To go and get in the UNIA, go and amass 1 million people at that time, right? To come and have the similar ideology. Again, when we're talking about when did we stop being African, in the early 1900s, we were still African. Maybe not completely, but we still had remnants of being African. Certainly, even in our marriage and our households, we were still African in our thinking. But of course, what eventually happens is Marcus Garvey, like the rest of them, is removed. But he never said that 50 million Africans in America supersede 800 million Africans in Africa. And I'm not saying this to try and create any kind of superiority complex, but home ultimately has to be where we look to. It's not just for African Americans, it's for Africans in the Caribbean, Africans in South America. There's a reason why a lot of people are moving to Ghana people from the Caribbean. Go and look online. And a bunch of people from the Caribbean doing the same thing. People recognizing that we have to look at home. If we don't look at home, then we are basically homeless people. Okay? So 800,000 Africans cannot be expected to see life through the eyes of 50 million Africans in America. So that's one thing we need to start understanding. Another point is African Americans and Afropeans, so I'm talking about black people who exist in Europe, our voices are the loudest. You see, in the black world, a handful of people have the power to change the way we think. Kanye West went and made a couple of shoes that are frankly very ugly, but we all went and bought them, even though he was making it for a European organization. LeBron James, Michael Jordan goes and makes a trainer, and we all, for 30, 40 years, are still wearing those trainers. Cardi B goes and says something in a song. Nas goes and says something in a song, and we are holding on to it. Jay-Z says something, we hold on to it. In the UK, Stormzy says something, we hold on to it. You understand? They go and make a movie, Wakanda Forever, even though it's made by a European enslavement system. We go and make it and we hold on to it. So we Africans in the West have the loudest voice. And if we say things publicly that are not encouraging of our situation, but also encouraging of our collectivity, then we have a major problem. We have a major problem that we can't get forward. So I think when we speak, the world hears. So we need to make sure what we're saying makes sense. This is for everybody, by the way. Everybody. This is not just the celebrities. This is for everybody. We cannot also afford to be oversensitive. Okay, I'm going to say that again. We cannot afford to be oversensitive. The time is over. The time has passed to be oversensitive. Excuse me. We cannot be oversensitive about things. The past is there. And we have to recognize the past and recognize that the past needs to be ticked off so that we can go forward. At the moment, we haven't reconciled ourselves with the past. At least some of us haven't. And we're focusing on the future. You know, again, FBA, ADOS, they're talking about reparations and talking about what is going to happen when they haven't even recognized their past. Again, this whole thing about ADOS and FBA, problematic because they said, okay, people who built America, who are indigenous to America, then none of you are indigenous to America. Because if you know from the history, every enslaved African person went to the Caribbean first. At least maybe not everyone, but at some point when the enslavement period happened, they weren't all going to Jamestown, Virginia. They were going to the Caribbean first, being sold and brought over. In fact, I think PBS did a series on this called Many Rivers to Cross, I think, maybe 10 years ago. Just look at how these things happened. Harvard has a good archive of the various ships and the movements that they made. So to go and say that the African people who claim to be ADOS or FBA are indigenous to America, it's ridiculous. It's just ridiculous. But that's neither here nor there, because ultimately the point I'm trying to make is we are being oversensitive about things that don't matter. I say this one, divest from the West. When I say divesting is crucial. Now, it's very difficult if you already live here. And no one is saying you have to physically move back home or anything like that. But you need to start beginning to plant your seeds at home. Every single person here, not everybody will be able to move back to Africa or to wherever, but we need to start planting our seeds back home. Whether it's just the physicality of going there, it might be later down the line, land. It might even just be a way of re-educating your children to say that you are African, not African American or anything. You are African. In the same way I raise my children. My children, it's a different situation because I was born in Africa, but it's still the same thing. They can very easily slip through the cracks and claim to be British. It could be, I was watching the England football team play, and there's a boy called Bukayo Saka playing for England. He refused to play for Nigeria. But he plays for England with a name like that, experienced all sorts of racism. But that's neither here nor there. The point I'm making is we need to begin to divest mentally and then eventually physically. The last one is travel. Travel, travel, travel. And in a minute, I'm going to give you some information as to how you could go ahead and do that. I'm considering doing my own trips too. I don't think I have the capacity for it, but travel. The way the world has become, it's become so easy to go to Africa. Africa also has become so much more appealing. I was supposed to do a live yesterday. My guest didn't come on. I had, for those of you who've been watching my channel for a little while, Demba, I brought him on a few years ago during the pandemic to talk about how to visit Senegal. I have been to numerous countries across West Africa, but I have to say that Senegal is my favorite place. Not only because it's just such a vibe, it's such an easy place to travel to. You could fly in there with any passport and not have to worry about anything. As long as you have an accommodation, they will allow you through, and you can go and experience Senegal. And if you do want to try and go through the whole, reconciling yourself with the enslavement past, there's a lot to see in Senegal. Gorée Island is obviously very important, but also it's about engulfing yourself in the culture. You see, we need to also get out of this whole thing of, oh, I went there and I went, for those of you who go regularly, this whole thing of I went there, stayed in a hotel, went to the slave sites. No, you need to go and try and see what life is like there for the people so that you understand the issues. Don't just talk to your hotel concierge. Don't just talk to your tour guide. Meet people. And that's why I always emphasize that when you travel to Africa, speak to as many people as you can who know someone there that can take you around. A local taking you around is far better than any tour guide. So these are a couple of places that I wanted to point out for you that you can go to. www.abibitumi.com. This is one of the ways that we could divest. Abibitumi.com is a I won't say black, it's an African-run website where literally they don't allow you unless you're African, run by Dr. Obadile Kambon. It's about 15 years old. I'm on it. It's the only social media. Actually, no, I lie. It used to be my only social media account, personal one, but it's completely African. You have to be African to be on it. And when I say African, I mean black. And I think these are ways that we could start making connections with people who are like-minded, because there's really no place for us to be like-minded. We're on YouTube now. At any point, they could choose to shut down the stream. At any point, they can choose to block me, block you, anybody. So even I'm conscious of the fact that we are on the oppressor's site. But of course, we have to transmit. And sometimes it's better to transmit to our people. I also upload these on Abibitumi. So you could go to Abibitumi. There's a YouTube version of it too called abibitumi.tv. So there's a YouTube version of it there too. The second one is the Sankofa Journey. Sankofajourney.com. I've talked about it numerous times. It's also run by the Kambon family. It's more of a spiritual trip. You see, because they are completely Pan-African in the sense where they see anything American as anti. Dr. Kambon and I were supposed to be in Egypt a few months ago, and he became a Ghanaian national. They petitioned for Ghanaian citizenship back in 2016. Him and a bunch of people that came from the Caribbean, came from the United States, and they got it in 2016. But he gave up on his American passport. So we had been trying to get a visa for him to go to Egypt, which is another problem. He was supposed to be in a documentary with me in Egypt, but now I have to go to Ghana and shoot with him. I shot my stuff in Egypt without him. But anyway, the point I'm making is they organized this Sankofa Journey, but because they are completely anti-USA in terms of even passport. And the Sankofa Journey is a spiritual journey where Dr. Kambon is installed, so he's also a spiritual traditional ruler in Mampong, near just outside Accra. And what they do is they make sure that when you come there, you're spiritually ready to see what you see, so that the emotion is gone out of you, but it's more of the understanding that I am back home. And one of the places that they went to a few years ago, I helped them organize, was to go to Dahomey. Went up to Abomey and the various sites that I mentioned in my documentary, the Dahomey Kingdom. And of course, if there's anything you're unsure about, email me, tftmproductions@gmail.com, or hit me up on IG, AEA Films, and I'll be happy to connect you, because I am adamant that the only way for us to break this monotony of ignorance and social media arguments is by traveling. We have to get on a plane and see what Africa is all about. Okay, brilliant. So I'm gonna read some of your comments. Thank you all for coming in today. So some of them I think I read out or mentioned whilst we were going on, so I'll just go with the more recent ones. Okay, Kujo Adkins Battle, good to see you. Our duty and the belief that it would earn us respect that we already should have had. I think you were referring to the Americanization of Africans, I think. Just remind me, I'm not sure. Okay, Sankara. Sankara, there you go. Sankara's got the image of Thomas Sankara I was talking about. Sankara, you from Burkina? Anyway, the West haven't learned from these events. We keep repeating them. Well, we haven't learned from the events either, you know. Okay, Kujo. Yes, I think we think that every generation is brand new or something, as if we don't stand on the foundation called history. Absolutely. Lizzie, Michael Manley in Jamaica was against taking that IMF money. Yep. I think I mentioned Michael Manley so that you understand. I think it was in reference to the film Kimada that I was referring to. So the film is essentially about how these mulatto mixed race, really white, closer to white, passing for white anyway, Africans started ruling places like Jamaica. So that's why. But yeah, he was against taking the IMF money. And of course, an ally of Bob Marley. But anyway, Onora has a great journey. Oh, thank you, Modine. Thank you very much. I appreciate that. Sankara, after the Civil Rights Act, most African Americans thought the struggle was over. They believed in the illusion of inclusion. And I think this is what we have to. Thank you very much for that comment. I think we have to get to a point where we realize we live in countries ultimately that don't want us there. And if they don't want us there, what is your get out mechanism? In other words, what's your backup plan? What do you do when a place doesn't want you? Because remember, when the emancipation was over, when the Africans were emancipated in the United States, all over really, even in the Caribbean. I think we talk too much about the USA. We really need to look at what happens in South America, Central America, and also in the Caribbean. When they were liberated, what did they do? Now, in those other places, they outnumbered the white people. So to an extent, gradually they started to get into power. But in the United States, where the opportunity you had was taken from you, and I'm talking really about Reconstruction period, where you see African Americans really rise to prominence in government, cities start to be created. These places were literally burnt down. So you're fighting a losing battle. And that's why I think it's so important to look elsewhere now, because it's clear America doesn't love you. America has never loved you, and America will never love you. And despite what they say regarding the census, the census prediction for 2040 or 2050, that black people or white people will be a minority, ultimately it will still be a version of white. It'll be Mexican or whatever. They will never allow African people. Sadly, you look at even what they do with the eugenicists, like the Planned Parenthood. And there's a very good movie about that too, actually, called Executive Action or Executive Decision. The film's about JFK assassination, but it's about why it happened and how these eugenicists essentially didn't want blacks and poor white people to rise to prominence. And so they decided, let's get rid of this guy JFK because he might allow it to happen. But Executive Action, I think, or Executive Order, one of those films from the 70s, I think. Really good film. But anyway, America doesn't love us. UK doesn't love us. France doesn't love us. Okay. After the Civil Rights Act, most African Americans thought the struggle. Oh yeah, sorry, I just read this. Okay, Lizzie. But what is worse now are the black gatekeepers aiding and keeping the drama going. Okay, Lizzie, I think this point, you're right. You're not wrong. I think where the issue becomes is when we focus on the individuals. I did a thing about the Nigerian election a few weeks ago. I also did one about Paul Kagame. Ultimately, there are gatekeepers, and there is a system that's going on. I think we can never really control too much, but the only thing that we could do is start to make our imprint in such a way where even if it's not us, our children or our children's children or somebody that is connected to us will be able to make a difference. You can't make a generation will not transform everything. It just creates the spark that does. So ultimately, we have to think a bit long term. And many of these people are dinosaurs. These gatekeepers, both in the United States of America, how long is Al Sharpton going to be your spokesperson? He's the only spokesperson. Look at all the spokespeople you could have had over the years, from Huey P. Newton and Malcolm and Martin and so on. These people's lives were taken away from them far too early, and so we're left with the Al Sharptons of the world, Jesse Jackson, and now even more detrimental than anything is celebrities, black celebrities, black singers, black entertainers. Those are not the people that are supposed to be speaking for us, and that becomes a problem. So we have this issue of gatekeepers all around, but I think it's people like us. You see, I think up to 17 or 18 people have been in this live today. These 17 or 18 people is what we need to focus on. And I have to emphasize this. The 17 or 18 people are what we need to focus on. We cannot focus on the larger issue, because the larger issue is going to be there. The system that we are fighting against, like I said, they have a 400-year-old head start. And now we are sleepwalking. We are sleepwalking. So Lizzie, I hear you, my sister, but I have to push back and say that we need to try and do something. We need to start making these moves. Okay? Cecilia, definitely, at least buy a small house or condo before you can't and rent it while you're not there. Absolutely. I'm going to do a show maybe tomorrow or the day after. I'm going to try and get a guest on to talk about how to travel to various places. And I'm happy to connect anybody. Any of the places I've been to, I know people everywhere. I went to international school in West Africa, so I know people all over Africa. If you want connections, let me know. I think it's very important that you start going to the continent. Sankara, we are not very good at observing past occurrences, assessing them, and correcting the behavior that led to our demise. We keep falling victim to the same simpleton tactics used by our enemies. Can't argue with that. But again, I have to say we need to do more. Okunini Kambon and his father are some of our best thinkers. Absolutely. Absolutely. Dr. Kambon used to be on YouTube too. Completely divested. All of his stuff is on abibi2metv.com. In fact, if you look at my documentaries, he's always credited at the end. So he and I have become very close over the years. But okay. The sad thing is, I truly believe we want to be accepted by mainstream Americans more than anything else. Kujo, by the way, Kujo, this is not just in the States, this is in Europe. And the theory is this. Anywhere in the world that you go, black or rather African people are at the bottom. It doesn't matter whether it's a religious sect, Islam. It doesn't matter whether it's a political sect, whether it was socialism. We are always at the bottom. The Soviet Union back in the 1960s and 70s, those people who aligned with them, the Lumumbas, you think they cared about Lumumba that much? I mean, they sent him troops in a way, but they didn't protect him they didn't protect him in the way that they would protected somebody else. Like these people ultimately, communism, Islam, Christianity, democracy, whatever the case may be, African people are at the bottom. And I think when an oppressed people sees that everybody doesn't like him, it's like the school bully. Before you realize that you need to defend yourself against a school bully, you try to make the bully like you. And we've been trying for so long in vain to make the bully like us. And sometimes the bully might, so you have those bullies that are schizophrenic sometimes. One day they put their arm around you, they act like they like you. The next day they make fun of you. Next day they beat you up. Next day they put their arm around you. So we are trying so desperately for the bully to like us when we need to mature. We need to be more mature and realize he's a bully. The only way you fight, the only way we win against the bully is either walk away, get away from him, or you beat him up. I'm also talking about African leadership too, not using the country's wealth to advance. But this is what I'm talking. Lizzie, I agree with you. I'm not disagreeing with you. I'm saying by the way, I'm talking in dualities. I'm talking of in the States. I'm talking of in Africa. Absolutely. Again, the episode I did on African elections. But again, I think if we focus too much on the leadership becomes, the leadership is bad. The leadership is bad all over in every system. Even the Europeans have bad leaders. Leadership in itself is not designed for the purpose of benefiting people. It's for benefiting individuals, corporations, and a small elite. That's how it's always been. But I think The problem with us as Africans is we're right at the bottom everywhere. So the only way that we can focus is to look at, see who we have together. You know, the concept of Ubuntu, if you want to go anywhere, you know, you have 5 individual fingers. Why is this thing blurry? 5 individual fingers, individually they mean nothing, right? But when they come together, it's better. That's why I say align yourself with people who are right-minded and thinking right, and create a movement. Dr. Kambon created Abibitumi on his own. And I know I keep talking about him, but I'm just saying there are a few people who are trying to do things. The Dr. Umar Johnson thing with his school, I love it in theory, but to me it's it's counterintuitive to build a school in the belly of the beast, in Babylon. You know, ultimately, even though the laws might be favorable, you could teach what you want. Ultimately, they can shut you down at any time. You are under their system, and also you are still paying your tax dollars to them. Those tuition fees don't go back to prosper Africa. They prosper the United States of America. That's the reality. And we have to face it. I am a hypocrite too. I am here living in England, paying my taxes to England. But I won't be for long. Anyway. Kujo, the bully thing was a good analogy. Thank you, my brother. And last comment, the leadership is a reflection of what the people will allow. And I must say this again, in Africa, we are incredibly backward. And in the West, we are also backward, but we think we're intelligent. And that's the problem. That's the problem. That's the problem when Ross Worm went to Liberia and thought he could civilize the locals. He went there, he didn't realize how backward he was. He thought he was going there to civilize the people who were ultimately civilized. You see, civilization doesn't mean that when a red light shows, my car stops. Civilization doesn't mean that when I flush the toilet, the toilet flushes and the water, the crap goes away. The civilization doesn't mean that when I want to go and buy something, or that my light works, or whatever. You see, civilization has to do with, are you civil? Are you able to live with people? That's what being civilized is. Because all these things that we're talking about, running a red light, toilet not flushing, there are consequences to all of them. You run a red light, you get a ticket. So really what they've created is a system where they keep us under control. We don't want to offend. And it's gone to a new level now. We don't want to offend. So what we end up doing is saying that, okay, no, this is a civilized society. No, it's a society that controls you. In Africa, you can go and live on your land, do your own thing. And obviously now it's a little bit crazy, but ultimately we will get back to where we need to be. I truly believe that. Anyway, and I think we will end on this final statement. The struggle continues. Lizzie and Sankara. Thank you very much, guys, for all your chats. Please, please, please be sure to, if you can't, I'm not making any recommendations, but if you want to support the channel, here are the ways you could PayPal or CashApp. You don't have to, but it would be nice if you did. But also, I think what you can do is please make sure you're hitting the like button. Make sure you hit the like button. Please try to share these videos. The more we can do, the better. They obviously take some time and planning to do, but I appreciate you guys for coming in. And if there's nothing else more to say, I wish you all peace. Have a great week. And hopefully I'll see you again either tomorrow or the day after. Take care, everybody. Have a good evening.